Episode 3, On the Trail, Capturing a Shadow. The shocking murder of St. Clair Community College student Scott Macklem cried out for justice, and the state of Michigan was determined to hold someone accountable for the crime, even in the face of a seemingly airtight alibi. But considering the methods and theories used to achieve that goal, we must question whether justice can possibly be served when a case relies heavily on conjecture, supposition, wild theories, faulty hypnosis, and unreliable witnesses. To understand the present, we must disassemble the past and learn how we arrived where we are today. I am your host, Aaron, and this is Framed. Please join us for a close examination of Justice on Trial, the Temujin Kensu story. This is Episode 3, On the Trail, Capturing a Shadow. Primary research and writing for this podcast by Kathleen McGrath of Thread Pillars Research. Music by the Captain of True Crime Garage. The Upper Peninsula, November 1986. In the wake of Scott Macklem's ruthlessly calculated murder, Port Huron investigators were hot on the trail of their prime suspect, Frederick Thomas Freeman. After his former landlord, Karen Sheeman, had identified him from photos she had been shown, police dug deeper into Fred's somewhat checkered past and uncovered various felony warrants had been issued against him. On Sunday, November 9th, Fred left his home in Rock, Michigan, and drove the back roads en route to visit a female friend in Metro Detroit. Days earlier, he had learned that police were looking for him from a friend of his who lived in Escanaba, Deal. Deal, whose father was an attorney, had shared with him that his dad had heard Freeman was wanted for a murder in Flint, Michigan. Fred repeatedly contacted the Flint police in hopes of resolving what he said must be a case of mistaken identity. He claimed he hadn't left the UP in weeks and therefore could not have been involved in any sort of crime, let alone a murder, downstate. Fred offered to come into the police department multiple times to discuss the issue in person and prove his innocence. The Flint police were unable to locate any record of a murder involving the name Fred had provided within their jurisdiction. Puzzled, they informed Freeman that he was not suspected of any crime, including murder, in the area, and eventually told him to stop calling. After being repeatedly assured that he was under no suspicion of any crime, Fred breathed a sigh of relief and stopped contacting the Flint Police Department. Meanwhile, without Fred's knowledge, the Port Huron Police Department had placed both he and his girlfriend, Michelle Woodworth, under active surveillance and were watching them closely. On November 10th, state troopers and a sheriff's deputy visited their residence in Rock. Disguised as deer hunters looking for a place to hunt, they knocked on the door of the couple's rented farmhouse. According to reports, Michelle told the men that her husband would be home later. 2 days later, Port Huron police obtained a warrant for Freeman's arrest. It was noted that the petitioner was Sergeant Bounds on info/belief. The following day, Thursday, November 13th, a judge from Delta County issued a search warrant for Frederick Freeman's person. Just as he'd been doing all week, Fred called his pregnant girlfriend on November 13th to check in, only to reach an agitated and thoroughly distraught Michelle. She greeted him by informing him that Port Huron police were currently at their home with a search warrant, and that they'd told her he was a suspect in a homicide investigation. Law enforcement had staged a SWAT-style raid, ripping through their rundown farmhouse, slashing pillows and mattresses, overturning furniture, and yanking out drawers, utterly terrifying the 18-year-old expectant mother. As outlined in Rabia Chowdhury's undisclosed podcast and in a YouTube interview with Kensu supporter Mike Mungan, Michelle related exactly how the search warrant was executed. She had received a phone call that morning from Port Huron Police Sergeant John Bounds. After Bounds identified himself, he instructed Michelle to put the phone down but not to hang up. She was told to go outside and walk down her driveway with her hands up. She asked if she could first get her coat, as it was November in the UP and the temperature was already freezing. But Bounds denied her request. She obeyed and walked to the end of her long driveway, only to be greeted by a line of police cars. Bounds then requested that she get in one of the cars, and after she did so, he proceeded to interrogate her. Following some basic questioning, police drove her back up the driveway to the residence, which by now was surrounded by armed, black-clad SWAT officers. Despite being confused and intimidated, Michelle still had the presence of mind to ask if they had a search warrant. She was told that they did, and they showed it to her. It would later be revealed that the warrant specified the search was for the person of Frederick Thomas Freeman, aka John Lamar, aka Mickey Ford, date of birth 5/23/63. Given that specific wording, why were they slashing pillows and tossing drawers, as if a grown adult man could be hidden within a pillow or stashed inside a kitchen drawer? Michelle admitted that she did not know much about search warrants, but she sensed something was very wrong about what was occurring at their home. Upon being told this news by his girlfriend, Fred asked a frightened Michelle to hand the phone to one of the Port Huron officers so he could speak with them directly. When she put Sergeant Bounds on the phone with Freeman, Bounds informed him he was wanted for the murder of Scott Macklem, a 20-year-old college sophomore at St. Clair Community College. But Freeman maintained he'd never heard of Scott Macklem and had no relationship with the victim. Sergeant Bounds then informed him that Macklem was the fiancé of Crystal Merrill, with whom Freeman had been involved in a short-term relationship. After learning the identity of the victim from the police, Fred claimed that he was still deeply confused as to why he was being targeted for this brutal murder in Port Huron. While he certainly recalled briefly dating Crystal and, on some level, knew she had once been involved with Macklem, the two hadn't spoken since July. Fred and Michelle had moved to the UP around Labor Day, and he insisted he had no knowledge of Crystal's renewed relationship with Macklem, nor was he aware that she was expecting Scott's baby or that the couple were engaged to be married. Even if he were aware of these things, it wouldn't have mattered to him, he said, since he'd long moved on from the fleeting relationship. Later, on the evening of November 13th, Freeman, known to the Merrills as John Lamar, called Merrill at her parents' farm in Croswell from a payphone in a Troy coffee shop in an attempt to understand what was happening and why anyone, especially the police, would think he was involved. Decades later, the man now known as Temujin Kensu would express an ongoing and deep regret that the phone call had not been recorded. At the time, he had no idea that law enforcement would be listening in. While the discussions happening during the call can be disputed, we have some idea of the things said from Freeman's trial transcripts. Crystal's mother answered the call around 8:20 p.m., but soon handed the phone to her husband. He didn't want to let Freeman speak with his daughter, and so he spent about 40 to 60 minutes with him on the phone, mostly listening, according to his own testimony at the trial. Halfway through that was when Sanilac County Sergeant Dave Hall arrived. What would later happen is after about 40 minutes or 60 minutes, Mr. Merrill would hand the phone over to the sergeant while Crystal got on the line upstairs. Freeman would then be speaking with her while the sergeant listened in. Crystal and her father's testimonies didn't quite line up, as he said he was on the line for 40 minutes, while Crystal said it was an hour. Mr. Merrill said the call went on till 12:40, and Crystal said it went on till 1:20, and that there was a 10-minute gap in there where Freeman had hung up but called back. Like I mentioned before, this call was not recorded. Sergeant Hall took shorthand notes throughout, so we have some understanding of what might have been said during the call, but a read-through of the trial transcripts provides a clear look at how the notes, and especially Sergeant Hall's testimony, might be somewhat questionable. The mission here was to find Frederick Freeman by tracing the call and not necessarily to get him to self-incriminate. But some things may have been said during this call between Freeman and the Merrills that could lead some to believe that law enforcement were focusing on the right suspect. Freeman's supporters believe that he was stunned to be wanted for Scott's murder and wanted to know what Crystal might have told the police and why. Those who trust the conviction see this nearly 5-hour phone call as a way for him to try and learn what he could from her and intimidate or coerce her into not cooperating with authorities. Crystal's testimony indicated that Freeman wanted to convince her he didn't kill Scott, but also that he wanted her to relate the details of the murder, to which she responded she couldn't. She also said that he seemed upset that she didn't know details because the murder must have made the news, but she responded that her parents were keeping her away from such information so she wouldn't get more upset. Because the authorities were trying to have the call traced, his hanging up at some point due to the restaurant closing meant that they had to start the trace all over again. Crystal stated that she did things to drag the call on, such as pretending to set the phone down to use the bathroom, crying, and talking about vitamins, one of Freeman's favorite subjects. She also brought up questions to see if he would verify the stories about him being a ninja in a secret organization, but he seemed confused as to why she would even be asking about those things. He denied all of that stuff. Interestingly, the idea that he was a ninja in a secret organization is something that Crystal gave extensive testimony on during the trial. For about 2 months, she said he practiced martial arts in front of her, showed her martial arts weapons and a ninja movie, showed her lots of cash that he kept on him, and drove her to places where supposedly she got glimpses of people who also worked in the organization. She also says he was recruiting her, but that if she didn't do what was asked of her, they could go after her and her family. On the face of it, this sounds ludicrous, but her accounts were fairly detailed. Defense attorney David Dean asked Crystal at trial if she got the idea from a 1980s movie called Tough Turf that starred James Spader and a very young Robert Downey Jr., but she denied it. Having now watched that movie myself, the only tie-in that I personally can see is how Frankie's character, played by Kim Richards, is controlled by Paul Mone's psychotic character Nick Hauser, who is the leader of a local gang, the Toughs. He does his best to control Frankie so that she does whatever he wants. This would fit with how the prosecution portrayed Freeman. The transcripts do show that David Dean took issue with how incriminating statements made by Sergeant Hall regarding what he heard on the call would not result in Crystal being called back to the stand. At the heart of this were Hall's notes, which were very brief in nature. About 4 days after the call, he used a tape recorder to set his recollections of the call down based on memory and his notes, and then someone else later transcribed them. During Sergeant Hall's testimony, he elaborated on his notes, but seemed to add details or worded things differently from what was jotted down. One such incident involved a discussion of the shotgun. Sergeant Hall noted that Freeman said he didn't own the gun and they will never find it. When pressed by Dean, it turns out the notes indicated that Freeman said he did not own the gun. There was nothing in the notes about they will never find it regarding the gun. Adding from memory such a strong statement as they will never find it led Dean to believe that Sergeant Hall was possibly creating some statements now. When pressed on why this was happening, Sergeant Hall could not recall exactly. Dean clearly took issue with Sergeant Hall testifying to things that weren't in his notes, some of which seemed detrimental to Freeman's defense. He brought this issue up to the judge, but the judge would rule against him and say the sergeant's memory based on the notes and transcription were adequate. They were made close to the time of the call. Dean clearly wanted to be able to ask Crystal about the things Sergeant Hall was saying, but he wasn't allowed to do so. But Dean made it a point to ask Sergeant Hall questions to drive home the point that other than statements that were unflattering about his client, they had no murder weapon, no car, no hard evidence to show Freeman did this. Sergeant Hall answered no to each of those questions. At some point during the call, Crystal told Freeman that she'd informed the police all about his martial arts training and skills. She said that she'd shared with them that he was essentially a ninja warrior and that he was the most likely person to have been responsible for Macklem's death. She said that his extensive collection of martial arts weapons, along with his background in Taekwondo, karate, and Kung Fu, practically proved his guilt of the crime. Freeman maintained the police were targeting the wrong guy and that he'd never threatened Macklem with any sort of violence. For nearly 2 hours, Freeman tried to persuade a distraught Merrill that he had absolutely no involvement in her fiancé's murder. As I said, police had urged Crystal to keep Fred on the line as long as she could, and eventually they were able to trace Fred's call to the payphone in the Troy Donut Shop. After locating him, they swooped in, arresting Frederick Thomas Freeman for the murder of Scott A. Macklem in the early morning hours of November 14, 1986. Fred was charged with first-degree murder in Scott Macklem's death. Again, Fred protested that he didn't even really know the unfortunate victim. He stated that he'd only encountered Macklem once at the video store where Crystal had worked, where the two apparently sized each other up. But his protests fell on deaf ears, and Freeman was taken to St. Clair County Jail, where he would be held until his trial the following April. Fred repeatedly asked to take a polygraph, but his request was denied. He would later assert that he was scheduled to take a polygraph after his arrest, but before that could happen, he was informed by the sheriff that Officer Bounds and Michigan State Prosecutor Robert Cleland had canceled it. Welcome back to November 1986, when Fred Freeman sat in county jail awaiting trial for the first-degree murder of college sophomore Scott Macklem. Digging a bit deeper into the circumstances surrounding this investigation and Fred's arrest would reveal some potentially troubling information about one of the members of law enforcement responsible for his arrest, as well as seriously question the validity of Freeman's defense. However, much of this information would not actually surface until decades later, when private investigators and supporters of Temujin Kensu uncovered what seemed to be deliberate oversights and other missteps in their subsequent examination of the investigation. According to a report by David Sanders entitled "Proving Innocence: Temujin Kensu Examination of a Wrongful Conviction," written on July 1, 2020, these inquiries indicated that Sergeant John Bounds, lead detective on the Scott Macklem homicide investigation, had been wholly unqualified for the job. The fact was that Sergeant Bounds had never led a murder investigation before. Indeed, it was only the second homicide probe he'd been involved with. He was simply filling in for a detective who was out on leave at the time, and shortly after the trial, Bounds would be returned to street patrol. In addition to his inexperience, a more serious infraction had surfaced regarding his background. Sergeant Bounds was a disgraced officer, having been fired from the Port Huron Police Department for misconduct prior to his being rehired by the department. His corruption charge and subsequent job loss stemmed from a 1981 probe by Gregory Riley, a special agent for the Michigan Attorney General's office. In conjunction with the Michigan State Police, the agent had been conducting an investigation at the Midway Inn, a Port Huron motel allegedly operating a bookmaking operation and high-stakes poker games. State investigators and the Michigan Attorney General's office were looking into Sergeant Bounds' involvement in this illegal operation. They learned that while Bounds was fully aware of the illegal gambling and numbers running that occurred at the location during that time, he made no arrests and reported no suspected violations of gambling or liquor laws. In 1982, Sergeant Bounds was fired for conduct unbecoming a police officer and neglect of duty. After being terminated from the Port Huron Police Department, Bounds would unsuccessfully sue for unemployment benefits. It is a matter of public record that he was represented by defense attorney David M. Dean, and that Bounds would ultimately lose his bid, as outlined in Bounds v. City of Port Huron 12-12. In a stunning twist, attorney David Dean would later go on to serve as the court-appointed lead defense counsel for Frederick Thomas Freeman in his first-degree murder case. Years later, in a 2004 Detroit Free Press article, Bounds would deny ever being represented by Dean in a legal matter, claiming to only have known the attorney socially. But as Fred subsequently discovered, he would have much bigger problems with his defense than this mere conflict of interest, outrageous as it was. Despite being publicly branded as unprofessional and convicted of misconduct, Bounds was eventually rehired by the Port Huron Police Department. The disgraced officer had only been reinstated by the department about a year before Scott Macklem's murder. He was put in charge of the homicide investigation despite the fact that he was a poor fit for the role. As alleged in the Proving Innocence article, the Port Huron police sergeant completely mismanaged the investigation. The article, as well as other sources, states that while overseeing an entirely incompetent investigation, Bounds failed to apply standard investigative procedures and practices. Instead, he appeared to have taken a tunnel vision approach, focusing solely on Fred Freeman as the suspect and neglecting to follow where the evidence took him. For example, fingerprints found on the empty box of shotgun ammunition at the crime scene were lifted, but once analyzed, they did not match Freeman. The shotgun shell discovered near the scene was never even tested for prints. No other physical evidence had surfaced that tied Fred to the crime in any way. A presumably different shotgun shell later turned into police several weeks after the murder had no prints on it and was a different gauge than the one used to kill Macklem. The murder weapon was never found, and Freeman was never proven to, or even legitimately suspected of, owning a shotgun. Moreover, police would be unable to find any trace of shotgun residue amongst Fred's clothing or belongings. Despite this lack of evidence, as well as the fingerprint evidence that should logically exclude Freeman, the state's prosecuting attorney had instructed Port Huron investigators to concentrate their efforts on Freeman and Freeman alone. According to a 2007 report by Michelle Crawley outlining WXYZ TV journalist Bill Proctor's later efforts to advocate for Fred Freeman, Sergeant Bounds kept evidence obtained in the early days of the investigation from his partner, Harry Hudson. Hudson, a far more experienced detective than Bounds, would likely have done things much differently had he been privy to the information that his partner had deliberately held back. He confirmed that he, too, had been directed by the state to place his sole focus upon Fred Freeman. This singular focus did not allow police to investigate other theories. It turned out that the victim, Scott Macklem, had been followed and threatened by two men in January and February of 1986, several months before his death. The men, who according to witnesses were visibly angry with Macklem, had allegedly confronted the student at his workplace. Bounds' investigation never included any attempt to identify these two individuals. Additionally, it emerged that Scott had been skipping classes with some frequency that semester, and the formerly solid student was now receiving failing grades in some subjects. A St. Clair Community College professor also told police that a few weeks before he was killed, Scott had told him that someone was after him, and that the young man seemed quite fearful. However, according to the Proving Innocence piece, Bounds' team neglected to follow up on this and interview the witness. A 2007 Detroit Metro Times article, Reasonable Doubt Part 2, further elaborated on the alternative suspect theory. While conducting their investigation, police began hearing whispers among locals that Scott may have been involved with narcotics activity. Considering the prominence of the Macklem family in the area and the looming threat of possible retaliation, folks were naturally reluctant to talk about this. To be clear, these rumors have never been substantiated and should not be considered fact. But hushed gossip and murmured speculation continued behind closed doors. If there was any truth to the allegations at all, this could likely account for unsettling visits from menacing strangers, as well as Scott's absences from school and his noticeable anxiety. Yet, despite having knowledge of these rumors of Scott's purported involvement with illegal drug use, Port Huron police neglected to request proper toxicology regarding Macklem's blood samples. Other omissions by the investigative team included the failure to interview Macklem's coworkers, classmates, and friends. There were no attempts made to establish where the victim had been the night prior to the murder, or why he might be skipping classes when he clearly remained on campus. As related in the Proving Innocence article, several witnesses on scene that morning had contended they had observed Scott running from the direction of the student center towards his car, which would effectively rule out the supposed mystery suspect in the mystery vehicle, which was already passing by Macklem from the other direction. Moreover, Bounds and his team wouldn't even thoroughly question Crystal Merrill about her whereabouts on the night before and the morning of the murder. Nor would they properly interview the Macklem parents, who initially admitted their son had never even mentioned Freeman or any of his aliases. And in a glaring oversight, police made no effort to talk to the victim's brother Jeff to learn of his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Furthermore, it would eventually be revealed that Port Huron police had failed to properly secure the crime scene and did not fingerprint the victim's vehicle, his gym bag, or any other belongings. Nor did they attempt to locate security video at the time of the shooting. First responders on the scene did not properly secure evidence for analysis, leading to an inability to perform proper forensic tests. With regard to his interactions with and treatment of the accused, Bounds and his team would perpetrate further indiscretions, said Proving Innocence author David Sanders. He would break what is considered to be standard police protocol in all state and federal jurisdictions by failing to properly interview Freeman. Worse, he failed to conduct an impartial and professional suspect witness lineup instead choosing to populate the lineup with several police officers whom at least one witness recognized as members of law enforcement. Similarly, he unfairly prejudiced witnesses during the photo array when he presented photos that were strongly suggestive of Freeman's guilt due to the composition of the photos. One of the most egregious and seemingly deliberate omissions made by Port Huron police during the investigation was their failure to reveal that Beth Steer had been pulled out of her class in high school and interviewed by police. Beth had been on a date with Freeman in Escanaba in the early morning hours on the very day that Macklem was murdered in Port Huron, 436 miles away. Beth would have been an undeniably strong alibi witness for Freeman had she been called to testify, but she was never summoned, perhaps because the details of her police interview had been intentionally withheld from the defense. Many other mistakes and omissions by the Port Huron police would ultimately be uncovered, but Sergeant Bound's transgressions during the investigation did not stop with incompetence. Michelle Woodworth, who never provided testimony on behalf of Freeman, would later assert that she had been terrorized and intimidated by Bounds. Exploring the reasons behind Michelle's absence as a defense witness, some sources suggest she could not be located in time for the trial, an assertion that seems unlikely. Based on the accounts of multiple sources, it appears far more plausible that Sergeant John Bounds deliberately threatened and intimidated Michelle to deter her from testifying, as Michelle herself has always maintained. A few months before Fred's trial, Sergeant Bounds tracked down Michelle to the apartment where she relocated with the purpose of interrogating her. According to a February 18, 1987 complaint filed by Michelle with the captain of the Port Huron Police Department, Bounds told the pregnant young woman that she would be having her baby in jail if she did not cooperate with the investigation. He threatened and intimidated her, implying that she'd be hauled off to prison if she withheld information. In response to her complaint, the Port Huron captain told Michelle that he would speak to his officer, but that he was within his rights to inform her that if she did not cooperate, she might be charged. Fred would later maintain that Michelle Woodworth did not testify due, in part, to this harassment on the part of Sergeant Bounds and the Port Huron police. Woodworth was his strongest alibi. She has never wavered in the fact that she says she was in bed with him in Escanaba, 436 miles away from the scene of the shooting, at the exact moment of the crime, which had occurred at 9 a.m. in Port Huron. In addition, Fred had multiple witnesses who would later attest to the fact that he was seen in downtown Escanaba at noon on the day of the crime, making it impossible for even a ninja to have been in Port Huron at 9 a.m. and then be seen a mere 3 hours later in the UP. And while there was no question that the young woman was terrified and nearly defeated by her treatment at the hands of Port Huron police, there was an even more significant reason that Michelle didn't testify. She wasn't called to do so by Fred's defense attorney, David Dean. Over a decade after the trial, in a polygraph examination arranged by private investigators working on Freeman's appeal, Michelle definitively stated that she was at home in bed in the UP with Freeman at 9 a.m. on November 5, 1986. This would seemingly render Richard Kruger's claims of seeing Freeman at 8:01 a.m. in Port Huron that same day impossible, not to mention eliminate any possibility that he'd fired a shotgun that killed a man there at 9 a.m. Moreover, Michelle had made Dean aware of this and confirmed her willingness to take the stand in support of Fred. The polygraph, which she passed, was administered in 1999 by an independent examiner. Michelle would later explain that while she'd informed Dean of her ability to testify to Fred's whereabouts on the morning in question, she was never subpoenaed. Given the overwhelming nature of the situation, her pregnancy, and her lack of understanding of the legal system, she did not have the emotional resources to question this oversight. To Freeman's ongoing regret, David M. Dean would serve as his court-appointed defense attorney during his April 1987 first-degree murder trial. As lead counsel for the accused, Dean would not provide the rigorous defense that Freeman had hoped for and to which he was entitled. In a classic case of ineffective counsel, Dean fell well short in challenging the alleged evidence presented against the defendant, nor did he ensure that Freeman's rights were upheld throughout the legal process. Dean had an unfortunate reputation for drug and alcohol abuse, and in fact, it later emerged that the attorney had been high on cocaine throughout the entirety of the trial. In addition to his failure to call key alibi witnesses for the defense, such as Michelle Woodworth, Dean also neglected to object to numerous questionable statements made by the prosecution. This resulted in the state potentially unfairly prejudicing the jury against the defendant. According to later statements made by Fred Freeman, Dean would not permit him to take the stand on his own behalf, even though he was ready and anxious to do so. He maintained that his defense counsel had falsely told him he was not allowed to testify. And, of course, had the information surfaced during trial that Dean had also represented Officer John Bounds in his unemployment lawsuit, a clear conflict of interest would have been immediately evident. Dean's representation of Sergeant Bounds, the arresting officer, and one of the star witnesses for the prosecution, could quite possibly have created a perception of divided loyalties or an outright bias against the defendant. David M. Dean's background and involvement in Freeman's murder trial is explored in the 2007 Detroit Metro Times article, Reasonable Doubt Part 2. As related in the article, Freeman had accepted Dean as his attorney upon the recommendation of a Port Huron police officer. Prior to earning his law degree, Dean, a Port Huron native, had been employed as a school teacher following his service in the U.S. Marine Corps. Hired by the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office in 1979, Dean seemed to be a rising star and was already handling several high-profile cases by the early 1980s. He remained at the prosecutor's office for 4 years, gaining attention with his involvement in cases such as the 1980 Stephen Campbell guilty verdict, which was credited with raising public awareness of assisted suicide in the state of Michigan. Dean had initially won a first-degree murder conviction when he prosecuted Campbell, who had provided a gun used in another man's suicide while drunk. But in 1984, this verdict would be overturned on appeal by the state Supreme Court, finding there was no law on the books in Michigan prohibiting assisted suicide. Several years later, defense attorneys for Jack Kevorkian, aka Dr. Death, would cite the Supreme Court's decision in the Campbell verdict in their arguments. Despite claiming to be a prosecutor at heart, like many young lawyers, Dean eventually decided to follow the money and switch to the defense side of the aisle. He opened a private practice as a criminal defense attorney, representing clients in all manner of charges. But with money often comes temptation, and Dean found he had a growing appetite for drugs, in particular cocaine, the quintessential drug of choice in the 1980s. Dean alleged that in order to avoid a conflict of interest, at some point he even stopped taking on cases involving substance abuse or narcotics charges because of his personal usage. Along with being a drug user, Dean ultimately admitted to managing the stress of his job with alcohol. As an owner of a bar/restaurant named Wall Street, in addition to his law practice, he would have had easy access to liquor and drugs. Despite his indulgences, he strenuously denied that his substance use had any negative effect upon his practice. But Freeman, who had first-hand knowledge of Dean's courtroom conduct and his many shortcomings, as well as a vested interest in his success, would eventually dispute this claim, as would many others. Fred Freeman would attempt to use it as a basis for his appeal. Dean's drug use was a major factor in the ordering of a new trial for another defendant, Randy Overton, who had been convicted of killing a friend in 1989. During Overton's appeal, Dean's own investigator secretary testified that she had been aware of her boss's drug use since 1987. In 1993, David Dean finally publicly admitted to struggling with substance abuse, disclosing that he'd been addicted to cocaine for the better part of the past 10 years. Regardless, even after this admission, he still insisted it had not affected his ability to provide effective counsel and was not a factor in the Freeman verdict. Dean was eventually suspended from practicing law due to his illegal drug use and ultimately disbarred. In addition to being disbarred, he was ordered to attend substance abuse counseling sessions. Dean, now deceased, had petitioned to have his license to practice law reinstated, but was denied in 2001 by the Michigan Attorney Discipline Board. St. Clair County District Court, Port Huron, April 1987. Having explored both a key figure behind Fred Freeman's arrest and his unfortunate choice of legal representation for his impending trial, let's now turn our attention to the pretrial motions in his swiftly approaching first-degree murder trial. Prior to the trial, motions in limine, or pretrial motions, were made to the court by both David Dean and Robert H. Cleland, the lead trial prosecutor for the state of Michigan. The presiding judge over Freeman's trial was Judge James T. Corden. Corden, a distinguished figure in Michigan's legal community, served as a circuit court judge in St. Clair County from 1978 to 1994. Numerous motions were made by defense attorney Dean on behalf of the defendant in the days leading up to the trial, which was scheduled to begin on April 28, 1987. After making, but then relinquishing a motion to dismiss the case entirely, Dean asked for the trial to be moved to a new site, as he did not think Freeman could get a fair trial in St. Clair County. The motion for a change of venue was denied. On April 27th, the court considered a motion in limine by the defendant to exclude certain witness testimonies. Among those on Dean's list to exclude was estranged wife Galen, to whom Freeman was still legally married. The court ruled that the defendant's wife could not testify due to spousal privilege, but reserved judgment on other witnesses the prosecution intended to call. The prosecutor sought to introduce evidence of prior bad acts under Rule 404B to demonstrate the defendant's motive, asserting that these acts showed a pattern of unlawful behavior in failed relationships. The court carefully analyzed this request, noting that while motive is relevant, it is not essential to proving murder. The judge determined that the evidence of prior bad acts lacked the necessary specificity and would be more prejudicial than probative. Consequently, the court granted the defendant's motion to exclude this evidence. Next, the court addressed the testimonies of Thomas Ford and Lori Cicerelli, who were on the list of prosecution witnesses in the case. Ford's testimony focused on the defendant's history of borrowing vehicles, which the prosecution argued was relevant to their theory that the defendant borrowed a car on the day of the murder. Although the vehicle connected to the crime was never found or otherwise identified, this testimony was deemed admissible for its relevance. Cicerelli's testimony pertained to firearms allegedly in the defendant's possession. While she acknowledged feeling a long, hard object in a duffel bag that could have been a firearm, she never saw the defendant possess a shotgun or any similar weapon. The defense argued that this evidence was not material, as it lacked clear connection to the murder weapon and instead could have been something completely innocent. Ultimately, the court ruled that the testimonies on relevant points, such as vehicle borrowing and possible access to firearms, could be presented to the jury. However, testimony regarding similar or bad acts by the defendant was excluded based on prior rulings. The court emphasized that the jury be allowed to decide the weight of this admissible evidence. Other accusations raised by Dean included an allegation that Fred had been denied the right to make telephone calls while awaiting trial, presumably to prevent him from establishing an alibi. Although he admitted to sometimes being able to reach Freeman via telephone, Dean implied that he'd often experienced firsthand difficulty in reaching his client. It appeared to have been Dean's pattern that he would call a client on the phone instead of visiting him at prison in order to confer about the case. Other issues raised by Dean included the ability for Freeman to appear in court in street clothes rather than jail greens, as well as allowing his client to shave. Dean alleged that Freeman had been denied the right to shave in jail and that he wanted his client to be clean-shaven when he appeared in court. The court ultimately gave permission to Dean to obtain some of Freeman's clothing from his home in the UP, as well as permitting Freeman to shave before appearing in court. With all of the pretrial motions resolved, the stage was now set for the trial to begin. Frederick Freeman would have his day in court and face judgment by a jury of his peers. Of particular interest would be the prosecution's attempts to overcome Freeman's airtight alibi of having been seen by multiple, unbiased witnesses both shortly before and after the murder. But would the verdict reflect a fair and honorable legal proceeding, or be based on a preposterous theory that could result in a grievous miscarriage of justice? Next on Justice on Trial, the Temujin Kensu story, Episode 4, The Trial Unfolds, The Prosecutor's Story. Nearly 40 years earlier to the day, that same man, at the time called Frederick Freeman, was sitting in St. Clair County Jail pending his April 1987 trial. He was facing first-degree murder charges in the death of St. Clair Community College student Scott Macklem, a member of a prominent Roswell, Michigan family. The motive for the killing seemed improbably thin. Port Huron police asserted that Freeman had shot the young man out of jealousy, based on his brief 2-month relationship with Macklem's fiancée, Crystal Merrill. The real hurdle was the fact that Freeman was seen 436 miles away right about the time of the shooting. Combined with the fact that no credible evidence of Fred's guilt could be found, the case should have been quite difficult to prove. However, the prosecution had a novel approach to presenting their case and a truly imaginative theory of how a cash-strapped 23-year-old who sometimes landed on the wrong side of the law could have accomplished what seemed to be impossible.